So the next area we want to work on is this carousel area. So we will go to our demo project. We have this carousel where we can move to the next slide. We can also use this button to move to the next and then the previous slide. So this is our hero section and we're about to build it in our project. Let's go back to our code. Close this and then close this. So we'll focus on the HTML for our hero section. After the header tag, we can add a section tag. Give it a class, should be hero area. Inside of it, create a div. The div should have a class called Carousel. Also an ID called main carousel. Inside this div, we can create another div. This div we're about to create is the div that is going to hold our carousel items. So we can give it a class. I will name it carousel track. In the carousel track, we can now have our carousel items. These items will comprise of the images and then the caption, which is the text and the button. Also, in this carousel class, we also create the dots, which we can click to move to a new slide, and also the next and previous button, which we can also click to move to the next slide or the previous slide. So in this carousel track, we'll add our carousel items. Create a div, and then we'll give it a class. This time, we'll name it carousel item, and then since this is the first item, we'll name it active. Inside this carousel item, we should add our image. The image source, we are going to get our images from the previous project. So all I'll do is to go to my document folder and then in the project sample main images, I'll copy this slider folder. The slider folder has our images, okay? So once I copy the slider folder, go back to documents, and in the blue wave air images, I can paste the folder here. Then minimize this. So we have image/slider, and then we can select slider 1. For the alt text, I can write slider image 1. And then the class will be slider bg. The next one to do is to add our caption. So we'll create a div for the caption. Give it a class, carousel caption. Remember, when you are typing, you should be careful to make sure that you are closing your tags where they are supposed to close. And make sure your code is well arranged, because if you make any mistake, you have to start from the beginning. So in the carousel caption, I want to add my h1. In the h1, I should have a span tag. And then I'll name it blue wave air. After the span, I'll write fly. Make this a capital letter. We have fly beyond the clouds. Add a p tag. In the p tag, we want to write safe. So we have safe, comfortable flights with excellent service and a calm journey above the clouds. This p tag should take a class. The class name should be lead. And then below this p, we have an anchor, which would be our button. For the href, provide hash. And the text should be learn more. Add a class to the button, name it btn, and then btn name. All right, since we have the slide 1, which is slide item 1, we can just name it slide 1. And then when you highlight this, you can press Ctrl ? To comment. So this is our slide 1. We can copy this and then paste it instead of retyping everything again. Make sure you give a space below. And then you want to remove the active. Only the first slide should have active. So when we move to the next slide, we can use JavaScript to remove this active and then provide it here. So the second slide should have slider 4. Should be slider image 2, but the same class, slider page. We have the caption. The caption should be, so we have experience the calm, travel in comfort. Change the E to capital letter. For the text, we want to type discover reliable routes and friendly staff ready to make your travel seamless. Also, we have learn more for the button. Then we can also comment this as slider 2. This is just to make our code readable. And then for the third slide, we want to copy this second slide and then paste it below. And then for the image, we want to type slider image 3 for the alternative text. The class should remain the same. For the H1, we want to provide your journey starts with trust. And then for the paragraph, we write So we have from booking to landing, Blue Wave Air is committed. Make sure your spelling is correct. Is committed to safety, reliability, and peace of mind. For the button, we'll change it to book a flight. We can also change the button for the second slide. You can write our services. And then that is it for the carousel track, which closes here. After the carousel track, we want to add the button for previous and next. So you can just call the button tag. In the button tag, we have a span. And the span will be a class having an icon. So the first icon should be a class with far chevron left. And then for the button, we want to add a class also. The class should be carousel control. And then previous. So this is the previous button, and it also have a class called carousel control. Make sure that whenever I provide a class that is having two words and I use a dash, make sure you provide that dash, because when we're about to style and this dash is not in your HTML. If you provide a dash in your CSS and you didn't provide it in HTML, your style won't apply to the elements. You can also provide an attribute called data action. And then this will take a value of previous. Copy this and then paste it below. So this will be for our next slide. Provide next, and in the data action, change the previous to next. For the icon, change it to chevron right. And then that is it for our previous and next button. The next one we want to provide is the dots. When we click on this dot, we should go to the carousel item representing that dot. So we'll create a container where we'll provide this dot later with JavaScript. Give it a class, and then we'll call it carousel dots. The ID should be carousel dot also. And that is it for our HTML. So in this carousel class or carousel div, we have the carousel track. The carousel track is holding the three carousel items. This is the div, and you can see where it closed. Also in the carousel div, we have the button, which is the left button and the right button. Then we have a container or a div where we're going to provide the dots using JavaScript. So when we click on each dot, it moves to the carousel item representing the dots. Now let's go to our browser to see what we have. In the browser, you can just refresh. This is carousel item 1. This is carousel item 2. and this carousel item true. This is the button. The dot will not appear yet until we create it using JavaScript. So we'll create it with JavaScript according to the number of carousel item we have. So if it's 3 carousel item, we'll be creating 3 dots. And if it's 4 carousel item, it will create 4 dots automatically. Back to our code. We want to start styling. So the next thing we want to do is to click on our index.css file. So once we are in the index.css file, we can divide the programming interface and then select HTML so that when we are looking at the elements in HTML, we can be styling it in CSS. So in the CSS, the first element we want to call is the hero area. We select the hero area, use the dot to select it since it's a class. And then in it, we want to provide position of relative, and then overflow of hidden. Now, why are we giving position of relative? We want to give it position relative so that we can position its child element inside the parent element. The hero area is a parent element, and we have this other child element in it. So we want to be able to position the child element to contain inside the parent element. And overflow hidden means that if the child element is too large or the height is too much for the parent element, it's going to hide inside of the parent element and not disrupt the next section we're going to create. The next class we want to style is the carousel class. And then we also give it position or relative. Why? Because it's also having some child elements that needs to fit inside the carousel container. And then the most interesting part is the carousel track. In the carousel track, we want to use display flex. Before we start the carousel track, let's see what we have already. I would like to refresh my page to see what we have. So when I refresh this, we don't have much changes because the position relative we've applied is to just make sure that the child elements fit in the parent container. So what we want to do now is when we add the carousel track style and give it display flex, we can now go and refresh to see what happens. So what happens is that it flexes the 3 items to be horizontal. So they are now displayed horizontally. Why they are displayed horizontally? We want a situation whereby only one of the item is displayed in the full 100% width, while the other items is displayed inside of the carousel container. So when we click on the next, this second item will appear. And when we click on the next, this third item will appear. So we have to give all of them 100% width. If we give them 100% width, these other 2 items will be hidden inside of the carousel container by the right. So back to our style. We want to add a transition. And then we'll give it transform. transform 6 seconds is. Now, why are we adding a transition transform? When these two carousel items is hidden, when they are to display, we want them to display with an animation style. Okay. So when we click on next, we want the second carousel item to display using a transition. And when we click on the next button again, we want the third carousel item to display using a transition. So back to our code, we want to call each carousel item and then we can give it a position of relative. The mean width should be 100%. When we give a mean width of 100%, it means that the width should not be less than 100%. And then for height, we will give it 560px. The overflow should be hidden. And then display should be flex. We want to align item center. And then we want to justify content. Flex start. Because of our time, I would like to write the CSS code I want to give it. Then I'll go to the browser to check, not writing one and going to check. But it's good as you are writing each style, you go and check what is actually happening. So but this position relative, overflow hidden, display flex, align item center, and justify content flex stats. This 5 style applies to the carousel caption. For example, position relative will enable us to position these inner elements inside the carousel item. Also, overflow hidden is to make sure that if this items is too large, for example, the image, it should not overflow out of this container. Even if it overflow, it should go below this container and not disrupt the next element we have to add on our page. Display flex, align items, all these apply to the content inside the carousel item. So our main focus is on the mean width and the height. Now that we have given each item a width, it means that it's now taking 100% of our screen. Then these two can now hide inside the carousel track. So when we go to our browser and we refresh, we can see that just one is being displayed and then the rest is hidden inside. We can't see our item now because we need to apply Z index to the item so that they can come up, but they're actually positioned here. Back to our code. We can now style each of the image. So we'll get the slider BG, which is the image class name. And then we want to give it, first of all, a width of 100%. So you should take the full width of the carousel item. Height of 100%. Remember, our carousel item is 560px. So when the image take the height of 100%, because the image is inside the carousel item, it means that it's going to take the full height of 560px. We have object fit of cover to make sure the image spreads well in the container. and then position should be absolute. With position absolute, we can make sure that left is 0, so it starts from the extreme left, and then top is 0 also. Now when we provide Z index, the image should have a visibility of 1. Now for the carousel caption, we have position of relative, and then a Z index of 2. Now, when we give the carousel caption a Z index of 2, it's going to appear after the slider BG. You know, the slider BG, which is the image, is having a Z index of 1. So for this caption to display on the image, we need to give it a Z index of 2. Padding will be 36px. Max width will be 60%. So now we've been able to style the carousel caption. Now we want to style the H1 and the P. But let's see what we have already. Okay, so this is our carousel caption. Back to the code. We want to style H1. So we use carousel caption H1. You know, whenever you're picking an element, it's good that you pick that element using the parent element. So when we call carousel caption H1, we know that we are picking the H1 inside the carousel caption. In case we have another H1 element elsewhere, it won't interrupt that element. A font size of 50px. We know what font size is now. So some of the elements we'll be using now is elements. We're just repeating the elements we've used before. So I don't need to explain those elements anymore. Font size is the size of the text. Font width is the thickness. So when I refresh, you can see how thick the element is now. Line height, I've explained line height already. So we'll give it 70px. Initially, when I explained line height, I used just a number without px. I used something like 1.45. So at that point, it's multiplying by the font size to get the actual line height. But when you provide a line height with px, it means that it's going to take only the px value you provided. Margin bottom, we apply to the bottom of the elements. We give it 20px. And then the color, we use a var, and then we want to use the text global variable, which is a dark color. Text transform should be uppercase. Now, text transform is to move the text from maybe a sentence case or a lowercase to uppercase. And then we move to the H1 span. The H1 span is the blue wave air itself. We want to style it separately. So with the help of the span inline elements, we can capture just a group of words and give it a particular style. So for this, we call the carousel caption H1 and then span. We give it a display block. Why do we give span display block? It will enable us apply some block styling to the span elements. So we have display block and the font size should be 30 px. The font width should be 700. Opacity 0.95. And then for color, we want to use this color. I think this color should be our primary color. So let me use the global variable primary to confirm that. Yeah, so that is it. The next element we want to style is the P element, which is the paragraph. So we have carousel caption. And then the paragraph element, they all have a class, which is lead. So we use the class instead. And then we want to give it a font size of 21 px. A margin bottom of 18 px. And a color, a global variable called text. We can now refresh our browser to see what we have. So we have this styling. Now we want to style the button, which is the anchor tag. Each of the button is named btn and btn main. So we want to call .btn display inline block. So inline block means that we can give this element, which is an inline element, a block style also. So we can provide both an inline style to the element and also a block styling. With that, we're able to provide padding. Padding of 12 px and 24 px. A border radius of 4 px. A font weight of 700. Text transform to uppercase. A border of 0. So if it has a border line initially, we want it to be 0. And then outline. Outline is almost the same thing as border, but not all elements has an outline. So the next thing we want to style is to call the btn main. And then we want to give it a background color. The background should take our primary color. And then the color should be white. When we hover on the button, which is btn main, we want the background to change slightly. So we have primary hover color. And that is it for the button. Let's refresh our browser to see what we have. Alright, so we can see our button is now showing. Back to the code. The next one we want to style is the dots. Okay, we've not styled this button. The button we styled initially is for the carousel item, which is the anchors in the carousel item. So our next styling should be the carousel controls, which is the button for previous and next item. We'll call the carousel control class. And then once we give it a position, absolute. The reason why I always emphasize about position is that I want you to understand what this position actually does. It really does a lot of work. This is a child element. The two button is a child element inside the carousel. And we've already given this carousel position of relative. So with that position relative, we can now position these two buttons anywhere inside the carousel. So with that, we're able to give the carousel control a position absolute. When you give it position absolute, the button will just look for anywhere to fit in inside the carousel. For example, let me refresh our browser. When I refresh this browser, you see that this button will change its position to fit in anywhere inside the carousel. So when I refresh, it's actually inside the carousel within this area. So it's either because of the Z index is inside. Remember, this image is having a Z index of 1, while this caption is having a Z index of 2. But the button itself is having a Z index of 0. So let me just provide the Z index for this button. So let me say I give it a Z index of 3. You will see that it will come to the foreground of both the image and the caption. Let me confirm. Z index of 3. Okay, why you're not seeing it yet is because it might be inside the overflow of this carousel caption. This image might be too big and it's going to contain everywhere here. But because of overflow hidden, it's inside. I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to say. So let's continue styling and you'll see the way it's going to pop out soon. Okay, let's just give it a top of 50%. Okay, I think now we can see it with this top. So this is it. You can see the button showing. The other button is inside. But the more we style, you will see it coming out. So a top of 50% will push it to the center, which means this is top 0, 50, and down will be 100. The reason why I'm explaining some of this style is because I've not used it or I've not explained it initially. We'll provide a transform and then we'll translate y. We'll translate y minus 50%. Anytime you see y in CSS, you should know that it means from top to down. Okay? Y is a vertical display from top to down. So if the control is up initially, when you transform translate y minus 50 is going to come from that up to the down. To display from up to down minus 50%. In essence, it's going to show in the middle. And then we can continue styling. We want to give it a width. Since it's a button, we should take a width of 44 px. 44 is okay. The same height. The border radius should be full circle. To achieve full circle of an element, you need to give it the same width and height, and then a border radius of 50%. Let's refresh to see if that actually works. So you can see a full circle. We will display flex. Sometimes we also use flex to position an element inside its parent element. So with the help of this flex, we want to use it to position the span inside this button. So we'll give it display flex, align item, center, justify contents, center. We'll give it a background. A color also, want to give it a white color. So text of white. And then the border will be 0. We've given it a Z index, which is why it's visible. And we want, when our cursor hover on it, it should display a pointer. And then when we go and refresh, from our display, you can see both the next and the previous button, they are together. So in the next code we'll be writing, I'm going to separate them. In the next line, we want to call the carousel control. And then when we hover on it, we want to change the background color. Then for the preview and next button, we want the preview button to position at the left and then the next button at the right. The reason why we're able to use left here is because carousel control already has a position of absolute. So we can use left, right, top, bottom to position it anywhere inside the carousel container. Now when we go and refresh, we might have spelled wrongly. So let's go back to our code to make the correction. We have the carousel pre, which is for previous, and then the carousel next. There's no need to give space here, all right? So just close the space here. This class, they are together. So if you want to pick them, you need to make sure that you are picking it without a space. And then when we go and refresh, you can now see the previous and then the next is here. The next thing we want to style is how the dots will look inside the carousel dots. Below, you can just call the carousel dots. And then we want to give it a position of absolutes. The left should be 50, so it can stay at the middle. So to just stay down at the middle. And then we want to transform. This time we will translate X because it's now horizontal. So translate X minus 50%. This will make sure it's positioned at the center bottom. So for the bottom, we want it to take 14px. Display will be flex. You know, we're going to have 3 dots because we're having 3 carousel items. So it's going to create 3 dots for us using JavaScript. You will see that when we get to that area. Just a little gap of 8px. And then the Z index will be 4. So you can see how we are increasing the Z index according to the elements we are putting in. Next, we want to style the button that JavaScript will create for us inside this carousel dots. So we call carousel dots and then button. This button does not exist yet. We are going to provide it as we move on, and you will see the code in the JavaScript area. The width and the height is 10 px, and then the border radius should be 50%, so that will form a little round circle. Border will be 0, white background will be an RGBA color. And then we want to add an active class to the button so that when any of the button is clicked to display its carousel item, we will know that we are actually in the second carousel item or the first carousel item. So we'll give it a background color of white. This will be our styling for the desktop view. We still have some style that will apply in tablet view and then mobile view. But before we apply those styles, we need to now work on our JavaScript. Before we start working on our JavaScript, let's refresh to see what we currently have. So when I refresh, you can now see our button is there. The reason why we're not seeing the dots is because we've not created it using JavaScript. Now back to our code. We now want to go to our JavaScript area, and this is the JavaScript file. So I can close this CSS and then I'll split the screen so we can have the HTML on one side and then JavaScript on the other side. In the JavaScript area, we want to create a function that will execute itself once the page loads. So I have this bracket, and in it I'll write a function. This function will be called init carousel. And then inside the function, we can now write our code. Now, whenever you're creating a function with a bracket, it means that you want that function to execute whenever the page loads. So add another bracket here, which will make this function a self-execution function. This means that once the page loads, this function will just execute and our code will start running. So the first thing we want in this function is to get the elements we're going to be working with. And one of the elements we need to get first of all is this carousel here. We want to get the carousel container. To do that, we'll create a constant variable and the name will be carousel. And then we can now get the elements and assign it to this carousel variable using documents.querySelector. We want to get the element by its ID. The ID is called main carousel. So we provide hash and then paste the name. The next thing we want to check is to make sure that we actually got this element into this variable before other code starts running. So if the element does not exist, which is this carousel, we want to stop running the code. If the element does not exist, the code will stop running. But if it exists, then we can get other elements. So we want to get the track, which is the carousel track. We would also create a constant variable called track. And then we have carousel. Here, instead of using document.querySelector, since we've gotten our parent element, we want to use that parent element to get every other child's element. And then the class name is carousel track. So this will store the elements inside the track variable. We also want to get the carousel items, and we'll store it in a variable called slides. We also want to get the previous button. So this is the previous button. We want to get it by its class. Paste it. Make sure when you paste this, you want to remove this space and replace it with dots. That's how you can pick these actual elements. Also, we want to get the next button. I should expand this since our main focus is on JavaScript, right? If you're not seeing the HTML, it doesn't matter. So I'll just copy the next class. Okay, we need to copy this guy first and then paste it. And then we can copy the carousel next. Or we'll just change it here. And lastly, we want to get this carousel dots. So we'll call it dots container. This time around, we'll use the hash, then we'll paste it. Remember to put your class and your ID in a quote. Now we've gotten the elements we need. What we want to do next is to initialize a current index. So we have let current index. Let it be 0. So this current index is actually the active slide. When this index changes, it means that the slide has changed. For example, if this is 0, it means that we are in the first slide. And if this is 1, we are in the second slide. If this is 2, we are in the third slide. Why are we using this index to represent the slide? When we get all the slide using the carousel track, we have the 3 slides stored inside here. And when they are stored here, these slides become an array. When it's an array stores value by indexing. So the first index of an array is always 0. So automatically, current index becomes 0. Take note of this slide and this current index. That's what we'll be working with. And if you miss the explanation of array indexing starting from 0, it means you have to go and study more about it. Let slide count. Now with this slide.length is a JavaScript keyword that we can use to get the total number of elements in this slide. We have 3 slide items. What will be stored in this count is 3. So let me just comment it here. 3 items. We want to create an interval. Interval is when we want each slide to show. For example, if you put, let's say 3 seconds, it means that every 3 seconds, the next slide should appear. So for now, we'll make it null. And then the time, we want to store the time in a variable. So we'll call it interval in milliseconds. We want it to be 9,000. So we have 9,000 milliseconds, which is 9 seconds. Every 9 seconds, we want the image to move to the next slide. Now that we've initialized these variables, we want to create the dots because we already have every other element, but we don't have the dots. So we need to create the dots. In order to create the dots, we use an if statement to loop through the slide, which will give us the total number of slides. Then we can now use it to create a dot for each of the slides. So to achieve that, we have this if statement. And the if statement has an index, which will be I, having a value of 0. To also have a condition. So we have let I be 0, and then a condition that I should be less than slide count. Okay. And then we can now increment I. Why am I having error here? Okay. The error is because I'm using if. We use for looping into an element. So the for will act as a counter for us. Remember, we want to create a for loop that will loop through the slide, and then for each slide it encounters, which is the carousel item, it will create a dot in which when we click, we can move to that particular carousel item. So we start with the let to create a variable called I, and this I must always be less than the number of items in the slide. So the slide length is 3. So I, starting from 0, we will have something like this: 0, 1, and then 2. We have 0, 1, and 2. It means that we've been able to look through the 3 items inside the slide, because I told you that this slide is an array, right? And the array is having an index of 0, 1, 2 for those 3 items. The first item is in an index of 0, second item is index of 1, and third item is index of 2. 3 in total. So when this is moving from 0 to 1 to 2, when it wants to get to 3, the last item is having an index of 2. So we've already gotten the 3 item at index 2. It must always be less than 3. So we have 0, 1, 2. When it wants to get to 3, it cannot go to 3 because the condition says that I must be less than 3. And that's why we always stop at 2. So with this, we have been able to create 3 dots. This I++ here enable us to always run the for loop. This is the incrementor. It will be incrementing the I until it gets to 2. And when it gets to 3, it will stop. We want to create a button. And then we want to set an attribute for this button. And since we've created the button, we can now use the button, which is btn, to set an attribute in it. We have a label. And the value of the button will be go to I, which is the actual slide we want to go to. So we have go to slide. We use the plus symbol to concatenate. And then in the bracket, we want to add I plus 1. So what this means is that go to slide I. Slide I is 0, but in the web browser, we don't have slide 0. We have 3 slides, which is 1, 2, 3. So we want the text to be go to slide 1. So 0 plus 1 becomes 1. When the index is 1, we have go to slide 1 plus 1 becomes 2, and like that. We have an if statement that checks the index, and if the index is 0, we want the particular button to be active. So if the first button is having an index of 0, then the button should be active. And remember what our active style does. The active style makes the button takes the white color, which is this. So we have button.active, and then gives it a white color. If it's not active, the button color will be gray, which is the dots. But when it becomes active, the button color becomes white. So that's what this actually does. The next one we want to do is to add an event listener to the button. We want, when we click on that button, let it display the slide that has that particular button. So we have add event listener. And then we have a click event. So when we click on each of the buttons, it will take us to the slide representing that button. And lastly, we want to append the button in the carousel. So we've been able to create a button for each of our slide. And when we click on that button, we want to go to that particular slide. After creating this button, we can now call the button and store it inside a variable called dots. So we'll use the dots container and then query selector to get all the buttons. Now we have gotten the button we just created. We want to work on the UI. How do we know the particular UI to display at a particular time? Or how do we display the first carousel item and know when to display the second carousel item and also the third carousel item? Remember that we have this current index here. So with this current index, we can use it to get the position of each of these carousel items. For this, we're going to create a function. We'll call this function update UI. And then in it, we want to call the carousel track, which is housing all the carousel. And then we want to add a CSS style to it. This time around, we call it JavaScript style. So you can use JavaScript to actually add a style to your HTML. So what we've written is, we've gotten the carousel track, which is housing all the carousel items. Then we say style.transform. What this means is that, let me go to my web browser. I will explain this very well so you understand. This is our view, okay? So let me draw. So this is our device, and this is the button. When this button is clicked, we're supposed to go to next. And when this button is clicked, we're supposed to go to previous, right? You should note that currently only one carousel item is showing. So I'll just name it item. Now, the other two carousel items are hidden inside here. At this point, we want, when we click on next, this guy should move to this place, and this one, this item 2, and item 3. We want, when we click on next, this one should move out, and then item 2 should be in our view position, okay? So that's what we're about to create here. With the transform, let me go back to where we created a code like that. Okay, so we have the carousel track, and this carousel track already have transform to be 6 seconds is, but we've not created the transform style yet, okay? So for you to perform an animation in a property called transform, you need to create that transform first. The transform we want to create is that it should have an animated style when it's trying to move to the next slide. So the code is, we're going to add this symbol. So this symbol is gotten when you press the shift key and you press the key before 1. Then you have this symbol. In it, we want to put translate X. Translate X means horizontally, right? We'll get the current index, then multiply it by 100, which is the screen size of that particular element. Now, what's happened is that if the current index is 0, when we multiply it by 100, we are still having 0%. So 0% means that we are still on the first slide, right? Now, when this current index changes to 1, we have 1 times 100, which is 100%. 100% means that we should now move to the second slide. And what will enable us move to the second slide is this minus sign. So when we translate X minus 100%, what will happen here is that this second slide will move to our main screen, and then the first slide will go out of the main screen. So I'll just add a drawing here. This will then be our slide 1. So once 2 comes here, here will become slide 1, and slide 3 will be in this position. I think I should just put it that way. So here becomes slide 2, And this, okay, let me erase this. And then we have slide 3 here. So that is what this code is actually doing. The next thing we want to do is to add the active class to both the slide and then the dots. So we have slides dots for each. For each slide, the first parameter should be for the slide, and then the index. For the slide, we want to add a class called active. So what this means is that once the current index is equal to the index of that slide in which we are in, we're going to toggle the active class on that particular slide. And the same thing we'll do for the button, which is the dots. We have D to represent the element and IDX to represent the index of that element. There's an error somewhere here. If this bracket is closing, okay, for each needs a bracket also, and it's going to close here. All right. So we have the dots, and we want to toggle a class which is active when the index is equal to the current index. So that is it. We've been able to toggle the active class when the current index matches the index of that particular slide or dot. Okay, for each needs its bracket also. So the for each has a bracket, and then inside that bracket, we're passing a parameter which we're going to use inside the function. The next thing I want to do is to create the previous function, the next function, and this goto function. Because this goto, we're calling it here, but we've not created it. So we need to create the function. Let's start with the next function. So for the next function, we want to be able to change the current index. When we click on next, we want to go to the next index. So we'll change the current index when we click on next. If it's 0, it's going to change to 1. Remember, when we have a current index of 0 and we add 1, it means 1, right? So when we click on next, if it's 0, we're going to go to 1. But we also need a way to reset it when we get to the last index. So with the help of this modulus slide count, we are able to compute for a situation where we get to the last index. What this means is that if this is 0, 0 plus 1 is 1, and 1 modulus 3 is 1. What do I mean by 1 modulus 3? What this means is that 1 divided by 3, whatever be the remainder, will be the next slide. So 1 plus 1 is 2. 2 divided by 3, whatever be the remainder, will take us to the next slide. Where it now becomes very important is when we get to the third slide. We are now in the second slide, right? So it's 2. 2 plus 1 is 3. 3 divided by 3, whatever be the remainder. Instead of moving to the next slide, this time around, we're moving to the starting, which is the first slide. So what will happen is that 2 plus 1 is 3. 3 divided by 3 is 1. Remember 0. So 0 is now the current index. So we're moving to the first line back again. That is how it continues. When it goes to next, that is what will continue to happen. And then we want to work for previous. For previous, we want to store the current index here, right? To move to the previous slide. So what we have here is to get the current index when we click on previous. Let's say, for instance, the current index is 0, which is the first slide. It means when we click on previous, we should go to the third slide, right? Which is of index 2. So if 0 minus 1, we have minus 1, plus the slide count is 3. So minus 1 plus 3 is going to be 2. So we have 2 modulus 3 because the slide count is 3. 2 modulus 3 is simply what? 2. How do we achieve that? It's 2 divided by 3. We have 0. Remainder what? Remainder 2. So that remainder is what we use for modulus. And that 2 is going to store here. So when 2 stores here, what do you think the index is? Is the index of the third slide. We have 0, 1, 2. So that's why previous will now go to the third slide. So you can see how this works. And then the last we have is the goto. So we'll create the goto function by saying function goto. We need to pass a parameter here. And then we have our current index, which will be equal to I This should be a curly brace. Do we still have an error? Please make sure you type it the way I typed it. When we click on the dots having the index of 0, we want it to store as 0. So the current index should store as 0. So to achieve that, if we click on index 0, which is the first dot, we're going to divide it by 3. So when 0 divides 3, we are having 0 remainder 0. So automatically we are storing 0 here. So the same thing happens if the dot we click is 1. So we have 1 here, and 1 divided 3, which is the slide count, is 0 remainder 1. The same thing if we click on 2. 2 divided 3 is 0 remainder 2. So those remainder is what stores as the current index. And then we can now go to the slide 2 or slide 1 or slide 3. Now we've been able to create our various functions. And remember, whenever each of these functions is clicked or triggered, they call the update UI function. The update UI function is this, which enable us move to the next slide and add the active class to both the slide and the dots. The next thing we want to do is to add a click event to the button, so that when this button is clicked, both for the previous and for the next, it calls the next function, while the previous button calls the previous function. For that, we have the next variable. So we want to check if the next variable exists, then we can now use it. We add an event listener called click. And then we add the function to it called next. Then we call reset interval. This reset interval function has not been created. We'll create it after this. And this. And then the previous button. If the previous button exists, we want to also add an event listener, which is a click. And then a function, which is previous. We've created the previous function already. There's a mistake here. So we have the previous function. And then we also call the reset interval, which we are going to create soon. So when this button is clicked, which is the next button, we are calling the next function. So this will execute and then to update the UI. We will click the previous button to call the previous function, which will execute, and then it will call the update UI and update the UI, which will go to the next slide. Next, we want to create a function. We'll call this function start interval. And this function will have the interval variable. And then we'll call the set interval, which is the default JavaScript set interval function. And then in it, we will call the next function. We want it to execute every interval milliseconds. And what is our interval milliseconds? 9 milliseconds. So every 9 seconds, we want the set interval to call the next function. So every 9 seconds, we are moving to the next slide. The next function we want to create is the reset interval function. And this function we call the clear interval. Clear interval is also a default JavaScript function, and then we'll pass our interval variable. We'll also call the start interval here. So for reset interval, one is being called upon. It's going to clear our current interval and then start a new interval. So that is it for reset interval. And remember, we have the start interval here, which is also called here. Lastly, we want to call the update UI variable, which should run, and then the start interval variable, which should also run. Something else we might want to try is when our mouse is on the slider, we don't want it to move to the next slide. So let's say we are reading something and we want to focus on the hero section. When we move our mouse to that hero section, we want the interval to be paused. And when we remove our mouse, the interval can then continue. So the slide keeps on moving. To achieve that, we have to call the carousel, and then we add the event listener, which is called mouse enter. And then it's going to call this function called clear interval. So when we are inside the carousel, we want to clear the interval from going to the next slide. And when we are out, we want the slide to continue. So we have mouse leave. At this point, we want to call a function which will start the interval. And then this is it for our carousel. So this is the code. You can screenshot it or you pause the video and then make sure you write it correctly without an error. But before we end today's class, let us test what we have. So I'll go to the browser, go to our code area and then refresh. I'll wait a little to see if there will be any movements. Okay, no movement. Try the button. So when I click on the next, no movement. Previous, no movement. So the next one we want to do is to debug our code to see what the issue actually is. One best proven way to debug our code is to go to the inspect section of our browser. But before we do that, let's go back to our code. While in our code, we need to go through the code to confirm that everything is okay. For example, if your code is having an issue, most times you have a line marked with red, which will indicate that there is an error in that line. But since we don't have such in our code, when we go back to our browser and right click, we can select inspect. When we select inspect, we can go to the console area because such issue will be a JavaScript error. In the console tab, we can see that we have uncaught type error and it says document.add event listener. So once we click on this index.js, we can go to the source of that file. So it's saying we have an error in this line where we created our function called init carousel. But you might not get the full information about this error. But as time goes on, you will know how to deal with error when an error occur in your code. Now, even as this error is showing that it's in the line where we created our function, I believe that this error must have occurred before this line, though it's indicating that it's on this line, but it should have occurred before this line. So I have to check the previous code to see if there was something I didn't do. So back to our code, if I should scroll up to where we created our function, remember this function is created and is created to execute immediately. So that's why we wrap it in this bracket. Normally we just have function and then init function. When I read through the previous code, we can see that there is no error. But one thing we should always take note is that when we are writing JavaScript code, we should always remember to end a code with semicolon. So you can see after I wrote this code, I close the semicolon. This should also happen to our functions. When you create a function and you are done with that particular function, you need to end with semicolon. What this indicates is that you've come to the end of this particular code and you want to start writing a new code. So semicolon is always good to end a particular program. Now, when we go back to our browser and we refresh, okay, we can see that the error is no longer in that particular line, but our code is not still working. Let's still scroll and see if we will see any other error. Okay, we have an error in this slide.forEach. It says it's a type error and slide.forEach is not a function. Let's go back to our code. Since it says it's in this line, the best way to approach this is to make sure your code is written correctly. So we have slide, which is supposed to contain 3 carousel items. And we look through the 3 items using for each. And then we took the slides and the index of the slide. And this enables us to toggle the active class for each slide, where the index, I'll just give a space here, is equal to the current index, which is this current index that enables us to move to the next slide. So when we go back to our code and we refresh, the error is still there. So back to our code. In our code, we want to check where we created these slides, okay? So when we scroll up, we have the slides here, and we set carousel, which is our parent element, dot query selector. We are meant to use query selector all here. Remember, we are meant to get 3 slides and then store them here. So to get all the elements of the carousel item, we use query selector all, okay? The second error is that we are picking carousel track here and we're also picking carousel track here. So let's go back to our HTML. In the HTML, we have carousel track, which is the parent holding the 3 carousel items. So what should be there for the slide is carousel item. We'll change the carousel track for the slide to carousel item. Okay, this will enable us get the 3 items and store them in slides. And then slides can then look through the 3 of them. So when we go to our browser and then we refresh, okay, we don't have the error anymore. We'll just wait for 9 seconds to see if there will be a change of slide. All right. So our code is now working very fine. When I click this button, I move to the next slide. When I click this button, I go to the previous slide. And we have the dots have been created using the tree slide. So whichever dot is active becomes white, and then we move to that slide. If I should click the first dot, I move to the first slide. All right. So we've done well. The next thing we want to do is to make this hero section responsive. This means that we have to build how it's meant to display in tablet view and also in mobile view. Because if I should adjust, you can see how this our carousel caption is being displayed. We need to reduce the size. We also need to reduce the padding and also the text size, most especially. So back to our code. Since we are done with the JavaScript, we can close it, and then we can open the CSS and the HTML. So we have the HTML open in one of the split tab, and then the CSS in one of the split tab. The first screen size we want to make responsive is the tablet view. So remember, to do that, we use media query, and then when the max width is 991px, which is our tablet view, we want the carousel caption to take a padding of 18px. Remember, the carousel caption is the one holding the text. We are reducing the padding. And then we want to also make the H1 smaller. So we'll call carousel caption H1. Give the font size 18px. The line height should be 60px. A margin bottom of 15px. And then we'll move to carousel caption, the H1 span. Here we want to give the span a font size of 21px. And then the P, which is the paragraph. Remember, we gave the P a class of lead. This is it. And then in tablet, we want to give it a font size of 18px. Lastly, we want to work on the mobile view, where the max width is 768px. So this will work for all mobile screens from 768px downward. This is media. We want the carousel caption to take a max width of 70%. We want the H1 to take a font size of 36px. A line height of 42px. And then a margin bottom of 15px. Next is the H1 span. We want to give the span a font size of 18 px. And then for the lead, we want to give it a font size also of 14 px. And this is what we have for our carousel area. Now we can go to our browser and then refresh. Okay, you can see it has changed. For a screen size of tablet, we have this. And for a screen size of desktop, we have this. In our next class, we'll be working on this area which says, welcome to Blue Wave Air. So see you in the next class.